It was an early morning in Vatican City, and the streets seemed unusually quiet. The usual hustle and bustle of tourists, pilgrims, and locals was missing. Today was not a day for sightseeing. The world had gathered for a reason. Pope Francis, the beloved leader of the Catholic Church, had passed away. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with a deep sense of loss that echoed through every corner of the Vatican. The sky was overcast, casting a gray hue over the ancient stone buildings. It looked as though even the heavens were mourning the Pope's death. People in black clothing slowly made their way toward St. Peter's Basilica. Some walked in silence, while others whispered prayers as they passed through the grand doors of the church. Everyone knew this would be a day marked by history, a day the world would never forget. Inside St. Peter's, the space was vast and filled with the quiet murmur of solemn conversations. The Vatican's Swiss guards stood in their usual positions, rigid and focused. Their uniforms, with their bright blue, yellow, and red colors, stood out against the dark, somber tone of the day. They had been trained for moments like this, moments of ceremony and protocol, moments where everything had to go perfectly. They stood in perfect formation, their eyes scanning the crowd, watching every movement with unwavering attention. Among the guards was Matteo, a young recruit who had only been serving for a year. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and eyes that held the seriousness of his job. But today there was something different in his expression. Despite the training and discipline he had undergone, the loss of Pope Francis had hit him deeply. The Pope had been a symbol of kindness and humility, someone who had made an impact on the lives of millions. To Matteo, it felt as if the heart of the church itself had stopped beating. As the morning went on, the Vatican grew busier. Foreign dignitaries and heads of state arrived, each one with a mix of respect and grief. The air was filled with a sense of anticipation. The Pope's funeral was not just a religious ceremony, it was an event that the world was watching. Cameras lined the streets outside, capturing every moment for the millions who were unable to be there in person. Matteo stood at attention near the entrance, his body tense with the weight of the day. He thought back to the time when he first met Pope Francis. It had been a brief encounter, but it had left a lasting impression. The Pope had smiled warmly at him and asked him how his training was going. Matteo, nervous and unsure, had stammered out an answer. But the Pope, with his gentle manner, had reassured him that everyone starts somewhere. That kindness had stayed with Matteo ever since, and now, standing in the Grand Basilica, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. The service was set to begin soon. The doors of St. Peter's Basilica slowly closed, and the crowd inside quieted down. Everyone took their places, cardinals in their red robes, dignitaries seated with reverence, and the Swiss guards still standing at their posts. Outside, the streets were lined with mourners, some holding candles, others with their heads bowed in prayer. Inside, the tension in the air was palpable. The Pope's casket, draped in the traditional white cloth, was placed at the altar, ready to begin its final journey. It was a symbol of the life that had been lived, a life that had touched so many. The service would be long, but no one in the room could take their eyes off the casket. Everyone was lost in their thoughts, reflecting on the Pope's teachings, his message of peace, and his call for compassion. As Matteo stood there, the weight of the moment settled on his shoulders. He had always known that days like this were part of his duty as a Swiss guard, but never in his life had he imagined that it would be a day like this. A day that would change the course of history. A day where he would stand witness to a moment that would forever be remembered. Matteo had always admired the Swiss Guard tradition. Since he was a boy, he had dreamt of wearing the iconic uniform. Its bright colors and intricate designs symbolized duty, honor, and loyalty. But now, standing in the grand, echoing halls of the Vatican, those ideals felt distant. It was a strange feeling for him, especially on a day like today. He had always been a person who believed in discipline, in following the rules without question. That's what he had been taught during his training, and that's what he had lived by. But something was different today. He couldn't explain it, but his usual focus seemed harder to maintain. The weight of the loss hung heavily over him, and it wasn't just because Pope Francis had passed away. It was because of everything the Pope had stood for, the kindness, the compassion, and the humility. Matteo had been one of the many guards who had stood watch during the Pope's visits, and on those occasions, He had often observed the way the Pope interacted with everyone around him. He wasn't distant or aloof like many might expect someone in such a high position to be. Instead, Pope Francis had a way of making everyone feel important, even for just a moment. The Pope's passing had shaken Matteo deeply. He had always admired the Pope's ability to connect with people, to show that a powerful figure didn't need to be intimidating. Instead of being a figure of grandeur, Pope Francis was someone who seemed genuinely concerned for the well-being of others. Matteo had seen this firsthand, as he often served near the Pope during public events. He remembered watching the Pope stop and bless a small child during one of his visits. It wasn't a grand planned gesture. It was simple and heartfelt. Matteo had been struck by how the Pope had made that child feel as though they were the most important person in the room. But now, standing in the Vatican, Matteo felt a sense of emptiness. The Pope was gone, and the church felt quieter, less vibrant. It was as if the energy that had once filled the space was slowly fading away. Matteo found himself thinking about the Pope's message of peace, about how the world needed more kindness and understanding, not less. He had always agreed with those teachings, but today it felt more personal. Today it felt as though the world had lost a guiding light. As the funeral service continued, Matteo tried to focus on his duty. He reminded himself that this was why he was here, to ensure that the ceremony went smoothly, to stand guard, to uphold tradition. But his mind kept drifting. He glanced around the basilica and saw the faces of so many people. Some had tears in their eyes, others looked lost in thought. All around him, there was a sense of sadness, and for a moment, Matteo wondered how anyone could carry on with such a heavy heart. He tried to shake off the feeling. He had a job to do, after all. His training had taught him how to handle moments like these, but there was something about the Pope's death that made it harder than usual to stay focused. Perhaps it was the suddenness of it all, or perhaps it was the fact that Matteo had always seen the Pope as a symbol of strength and kindness, and now that symbol was gone. He had never expected it to feel so real, so deeply personal. As he stood there, his posture stiff and his eyes scanning the crowd, Matteo couldn't help but wonder what the future would look like without Pope Francis. The Vatican would continue, of course, but there would be a new Pope, and things would change. Matteo couldn't shake the feeling that the world had just lost something irreplaceable, something that, no matter how hard anyone tried, could never be recreated. It was in that moment, amid the quiet reverence of the basilica, that Matteo realized just how much of an impact the Pope had made on his life. The Pope had inspired him to live a life of purpose, to stand for something greater than himself. And now, even in his grief, Matteo knew that the Pope's legacy would live on in the hearts of those who had been touched by his message. The feeling of loss was sharp, but there was also a sense of hope. Perhaps that was what the Pope had always wanted, to leave behind a world that, despite its challenges, still held on to the idea of compassion and love. The silence of the Vatican Basilica was thick, and the air felt almost too heavy to breathe. Every person present seemed lost in their own thoughts, their heads bowed in quiet respect. The ceremony continued in a slow, steady rhythm, with each prayer and hymn deepening the sense of sorrow in the room. It was a moment meant to honor Pope Francis, but for many, it was hard to keep their minds focused. The loss was too raw, too recent. Matteo stood in his usual position near the entrance, his posture stiff, his face a mask of concentration. The familiar routine was supposed to give him comfort, to help him push away the emotions that were threatening to overwhelm him. He had always prided himself on his discipline. The Swiss Guard was known for its perfect attention to detail, for its unyielding commitment to protocol. This was the standard by which Matteo had lived since joining the force. It was what he had been trained for, what he had spent years preparing for. But today, the weight of grief made it harder to follow the rules. Matteo's mind kept returning to the Pope, his kindness, his smile, and the gentle way he had touched the lives of so many. It was impossible to forget how the Pope had treated every person he encountered as though they were important. That was the legacy he had left behind, a legacy that seemed to fade with each passing second. The more Matteo thought about it, the more difficult it became to stay focused on his duty. The rules no longer seemed as important as the sadness he felt inside. As the funeral procession moved toward the altar, something within Matteo snapped. He had never broken protocol before, He had spent every day learning to maintain his composure, to never waver in his duties. Yet, in that moment, as the casket of Pope Francis was carried through the basilica, something inside him shifted. Without thinking, Matteo stepped forward, his boots clicking against the cold stone floor. He moved away from his assigned spot and knelt on one knee, bowing his head and placing a hand over his heart. It was a small gesture, but it felt as though the world had stopped around him. The gasps of shock that followed his sudden movement echoed through the basilica. For a brief moment, the solemnity of the ceremony was broken. People turned to look at him, and a few guards stiffened in surprise. They had all been trained to remain unmoving, to keep their emotions in check. Yet here was Matteo, breaking that sacred rule, his face wet with tears as he silently mourned the Pope's passing. The room seemed to hold its breath. The murmurs grew, but no one dared to speak loudly. Matteo's heart pounded in his chest as he stayed kneeling, his gaze fixed on the casket. He knew what he had done. He knew that his actions had gone against everything he had been taught. But in that moment, he didn't care about protocol. He cared only about the grief he felt, the loss of someone who had meant so much to him and so many others. It wasn't just the Pope's passing that had brought Matteo to this point. It was the way the Pope had lived his life. It was the way he had made people feel seen and valued, no matter who they were. That was what Matteo was mourning, not just the Pope's death, but the end of an era of compassion and kindness. He wanted to honor that in whatever way he could, even if it meant breaking the rules. Matteo stayed there, kneeling on the floor, his eyes closed in silent prayer. The minutes passed slowly, and the ceremony continued around him. The quiet hum of the crowd, the soft voices of the cardinals, and the faint sounds of the hymn seemed distant to him now. He was lost in his own thoughts, in his own grief, and he wasn't sure when or if he would rise. It wasn't until a soft voice spoke his name that Matteo finally looked up. Standing before him was one of the cardinals, his expression filled with understanding. The cardinal didn't scold him. He didn't shout or show any anger. Instead, he simply extended a hand to Matteo, gently pulling him to his feet. "You are allowed to mourn too, my son," the cardinal said quietly, his voice calm and reassuring. Matteo's heart swelled with emotion as he slowly rose. The cardinal's words struck a deep chord within him. In that moment, Matteo realized that it was okay to feel, that even in a place of such strict tradition, there was room for humanity, for grief, and for honoring the memory of someone who had made the world a better place. He returned to his post, his heart still heavy but lighter than before. His actions had broken protocol, but in doing so, he had shown that even the most disciplined could be touched by something greater than duty alone. The Pope's death had shattered something inside him, but it had also opened his heart to a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly serve. The room was still, the quiet only broken by the soft sounds of the ceremony continuing. The Pope's casket had been placed in the center of St. Peter's Basilica, surrounded by candlelight, and the cardinals were now gathered around, chanting the prayers for the deceased. Everything seemed to follow its expected rhythm. As the service continued, the atmosphere in St. Peter's Basilica slowly began to return to its somber rhythm. The new Pope's unexpected gesture toward Matteo had shifted the mood in the room. The tension that had filled the air earlier seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding. People were still grieving, but now there was a sense of shared emotion. It was as if everyone present had silently agreed that mourning was not just for the elite or the powerful, it was something that united them all. Matteo stood at his post once again, but this time he felt different. There was a weight lifted from his shoulders, a sense that the rules, while important, did not have to come before humanity. His heart was still heavy with sorrow for Pope Francis, but it no longer felt as though he was carrying that weight alone. He thought about the Pope's life, how he had spent so many years guiding the faithful with compassion and humility. Now, the world was left to honor that legacy, but in a way that seemed more personal than ever before. As the hours passed, the funeral ceremony drew to a close. The Pope's casket was slowly moved toward the altar, where it would be prepared for its final journey. Matteo could feel the eyes of the room on him, but instead of the pressure he had felt earlier, he felt a sense of calm. It was as though he had been given permission to grieve, to express his sorrow in whatever way he needed. This was not a moment for perfection. It was a moment to be human. Outside, the crowd of mourners had begun to grow restless. The ceremony was reaching its final moments, but many people still stood quietly in the streets of Vatican City, hoping to catch one last glimpse of Pope Francis. Matteo had always believed in the importance of duty, but today, something had changed within him. He realized that sometimes duty wasn't just about standing guard or following the rules. Sometimes it was about showing up when it mattered most, and today it had mattered in ways he had never expected. He thought back to the Pope's message of peace, how the Pope had always talked about unity, love, and understanding. Those words had always seemed important, but now, standing in the heart of the Vatican, they felt even more powerful. The Pope's death had left a void, but in that emptiness, there was also the potential for something new. Maybe it was up to the people who had been touched by the Pope's kindness to carry his message forward. Maybe it was up to the ones who had learned from his example to continue his work of bringing people together, even in times of sorrow. As Matteo stood there, his eyes following the casket's slow procession, he couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve. He had always thought that his role as a Swiss guard was about protection, about guarding the Pope's safety and ensuring that everything was in order. But now he understood that his role was more than just physical security. It was about standing witness to moments like this, where human emotion, compassion, and grace took precedence over everything else. It was about holding the line, yes, but also about understanding when to bend, when to show compassion, and when to be present in a way that mattered. When the ceremony finally ended, and the Pope's casket was taken away, the room was filled with a quiet, almost reverent stillness. The guards, the dignitaries, the mourners, they all slowly began to file out, each person lost in their own thoughts. Matteo stayed behind for a few moments, taking in the grand, yet somber space around him. The basilica seemed emptier now, as though it too was grieving. But Matteo knew that the memory of Pope Francis would never truly leave. It would live on in the hearts of those who had witnessed his kindness, in the lessons he had taught through his actions. As he walked out of the basilica, Matteo felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. The weight of the day still hung over him, but it no longer felt unbearable. There was a lesson in the Pope's death, a lesson that Matteo had learned in his own way. Sometimes breaking protocol, breaking the rules, was necessary to show the true depth of one's feelings. It was a reminder that even in the midst of duty, there was always room for humanity, and perhaps that was the true lesson the Pope had wanted to teach. That love, compassion, and understanding should always come first, no matter the situation. As the sun began to set over Vatican City, Matteo walked through the streets, his steps slower now. The city, still holding its breath, seemed to carry the echoes of the day. And with those echoes, Matteo felt ready to carry on. The next few days felt like a blur for Matteo. The world outside the Vatican continued on, but inside it felt like everything had come to a standstill. He went through his duties as usual, standing at his post, following his orders, and maintaining the routines that had been drilled into him. But in the quiet moments, when the noise of the day faded away, he couldn't shake the events of the funeral from his mind. He spent a lot of time reflecting, walking around the Vatican when his shift ended, trying to make sense of everything. The images from the ceremony still played in his mind, the soft glow of the candles, the slow procession of the Pope's casket, and the calm, reassuring presence of the new Pope. It was as though the entire world had paused, just for a moment, to acknowledge the passing of someone so great. Matteo had never imagined that he would feel so connected to something so much bigger than himself. The days following the funeral were filled with messages from all over the world. The Pope's death had left an emptiness in so many hearts, and yet, in the sadness, there was also a shared sense of unity. People from every corner of the earth mourned, and Matteo could feel that bond. It was as if the Pope's death had somehow brought everyone closer together, united in grief, but also in hope for a better world. He had never realized how deeply connected the world could be through something as simple as mourning. One afternoon, while taking a break in the quiet gardens of the Vatican, Matteo found himself sitting on a bench, lost in thought. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the stone path. He watched the leaves of the trees rustle gently in the breeze. The world felt peaceful here, but inside, Matteo's mind was anything but calm. He was still trying to understand what had happened that day during the funeral. He had never expected to break protocol, never imagined that he would kneel in front of the Pope's casket. Yet, somehow, it had felt like the right thing to do. The new Pope's words echoed in his mind, "You are allowed to mourn too, my son." Those words had stayed with him, reminding him that even someone as disciplined and strong as he was could feel loss. It was okay to grieve, to show emotion, even in a place that demanded order and structure. Matteo had spent so many years learning to hide his feelings, to keep them locked inside. But now he understood that doing so wasn't always the answer. He thought about the Pope's teachings, his calls for peace, kindness, and compassion. They had always seemed important, but now they felt even more meaningful. Matteo realized that those lessons weren't just for others. They were for him too. He didn't need to be perfect, didn't need to hide behind the uniform or the rules. It was okay to let go of some of that control, to be human, to feel, and to show kindness when it was needed most. As Matteo sat there, the sun setting behind the tall walls of the Vatican, he felt a sense of quiet resolution. He had learned something valuable in those difficult days, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Pope's death had opened his heart in a way he never expected, and now he felt ready to carry that lesson forward, not just as a Swiss guard, but as a person who had learned to embrace the true meaning of compassion. Life at the Vatican slowly began to return to its usual rhythm. The streets around St. Peter's Basilica, which had been filled with mourners and tourists, quieted down. The events of the Pope's funeral, still fresh in many minds, faded into the past. Yet for Matteo, things were different. He found himself changed in ways he hadn't fully understood, and the impact of those days lingered with him. His daily routine felt the same. He stood at his post, just as he had done countless times before, but his mind often wandered. There was a quiet stillness within him now, a softness that hadn't been there before. It wasn't that he had lost his discipline. He still honored his duties with the same dedication. But there was a new understanding in him, a deeper connection to the world beyond his uniform. The grief he had felt during the Pope's funeral had shifted something inside him, and he couldn't ignore it. One day, as Matteo was walking through the corridors of the Vatican, he noticed something he hadn't before. A small group of visitors had gathered at a side chapel, speaking softly among themselves. Normally, he would have walked past without a second thought, but today, something made him pause. He saw a woman gently placing a candle on the altar, her eyes closed in quiet prayer. Her face was filled with the same sadness that had been in his own heart just days before. The simple act of lighting a candle, the small moment of quiet reflection, struck him deeply. Without fully understanding why, Matteo found himself walking toward the chapel. He stopped just outside the door, watching the visitors in their solemn moments. It was in that instant that he realized how much of the world he had missed by focusing only on duty. His role, important as it was, had often kept him from truly seeing the people around him. He had always been so focused on following orders and maintaining order that he had forgotten to stop and understand the human side of life, the side that was fragile, emotional, and full of depth. As Matteo stood there, he thought about the Pope once more. The Pope had always embraced the humanity in others, never hesitating to show kindness and compassion. Those were qualities Matteo had admired but never fully understood. Now he realized that the Pope's example was not something to simply respect from afar. It was something to live by. Matteo could no longer ignore the importance of those small, meaningful moments, the quiet gestures of kindness, the shared moments of sorrow, and the connections that united everyone. Over the next few weeks, Matteo began to change how he interacted with others. He started to notice the people around him, the visitors, the fellow guards, the staff, and he made a conscious effort to show kindness, to listen, to truly be present in the moment. He no longer felt the need to hide his emotions behind the walls of duty. Instead, he embraced the idea that he could be strong and disciplined while still allowing himself to be human. The transformation was not immediate, and it wasn't always easy. There were days when he felt the weight of the old habits pulling at him. But with each passing day, Matteo grew more comfortable in this new way of being. He didn't have to hide behind his uniform anymore. He could still serve with honor and dignity, but he could also offer understanding, compassion, and kindness to those around him. As he walked through the Vatican one evening, the sunset casting a golden light over the stone walls, Matteo realized that the change he had experienced was something that would stay with him. He had learned that sometimes the greatest strength wasn't in following the rules perfectly, but in showing care for others, even when it wasn't required. It was in those small, quiet moments of connection that Matteo found his true sense of purpose. The days continued to pass, and Vatican City slowly returned to its daily rhythm, though for Matteo, nothing felt quite the same. The lessons learned from the funeral and the moments that followed had left a lasting impact. There was a quiet change within him, and it was something he carried with him wherever he went. One afternoon, while standing guard at one of the basilica's entrances, Matteo observed the steady stream of visitors. Tourists from all over the world walked through the gates, some whispering in awe as they gazed at the grand architecture, while others paused to pray quietly in the chapel. Matteo had always seen these visitors as just a part of his job, something he had to oversee. But now something was different. He found himself watching them not with the detached gaze of a guard, but with a new sense of appreciation. He noticed the way a young boy held his mother's hand, looking up at the towering statues with wide eyes. He saw a couple, clearly tired from their travels, sitting on the steps of the basilica, silently sharing a moment of rest. He saw elderly visitors moving slowly, but with a sense of reverence as they made their way through the space. Each one, in their own way, was connected to something greater. It was a reminder to Matteo that the world was made up of so many lives, each with its own story, its own struggles, and its own joy. As Matteo continued to observe, he remembered the Pope's message of unity and love. The Pope had always spoken about the importance of seeing each person as a part of a greater whole, to understand that everyone had something to contribute. Matteo had once thought of these visitors as strangers, people who passed through without much thought. But now, he realized they were all a part of the same tapestry, connected by their shared humanity. His role as a Swiss guard hadn't changed, but his perspective had. He had always believed his job was to protect, to stand at attention, and to uphold the rules. But now he understood that protection wasn't just about keeping the Pope and the Vatican safe. It was also about caring for the people who came to visit, showing them the respect and kindness they deserved. His mission was more than just duty. It was also about understanding the people he was serving and recognizing their shared experience. Over the following weeks, Matteo found himself growing into this new understanding. He didn't simply stand at his post anymore. He interacted with the visitors in small ways. He offered a warm smile, a gentle nod of acknowledgement, and even sometimes stopped to ask if anyone needed help. It was a small change, but it made a big difference in how he felt. The rigid boundaries that had once separated him from the people around him began to dissolve. Instead of feeling like an outsider, he felt connected to the world he had been guarding all along. One evening, as Matteo walked through the Vatican's quiet courtyards, he reflected on the journey he had been on. He thought about how the Pope's death, a moment of immense sadness, had become a turning point in his own life. He had learned that strength wasn't just about following orders or standing firm in the face of adversity. True strength came from being able to embrace one's own emotions, to connect with others, and to show kindness in ways big and small. As he looked out over the gardens, the warm glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the path, Matteo felt a deep sense of peace. He knew the road ahead would not always be easy, but he had learned something valuable. No matter the duty, no matter the challenge, there was always room for humanity, and that was the greatest strength of all.